So, Professor, we have a situation where John Bolton leaves the administration just days ago. He claims that he resigned. Trump claims that he fired him. And then it's almost as if, like, instead of a gold watch, there was a big gift that was sent to him in some way. It looked, and it's still quite possible, but it looked like the Trump administration was at least proclaiming a casus belli, as it were. But before we get into the specifics, will you just go back and just give us a brief summary of where we are with Iran, how far our relationship has disintegrated since the Obama Iranian nuclear deal, and the attempts, the most recent attempts to sort of, I guess, by France in particular, to create a new deal that looked a lot like the old deal, but presumably would be referred to as Trump's deal.
That's right. Well, it's amazing to think about it, but in 2016, after the Iran nuclear deal was signed, there was a prospect that Iran might buy 100 passenger jets from Boeing. All the sanctions were supposed to be off of Iran economically, and it was supposed to be let into the world economy. That was the United Nations Security Council took off all of its sanctions, and each of the major blocs, Europe and the United States and so forth, were supposed to as well. And so there's this prospect of this burgeoning economy. It's an economy as large as Poland's, with a population the size of Germany, would be a new player in the world scene, and there was a lot of money to be made by Americans. And then in May of 2018,
before we get to there, I just want to explore this just a little bit so that we can really fully grasp the implications. I mean, one of the things that was left out of the negotiations for that deal specifically was Iranian involvement in groups that the United States considers to be terrorist groups, arguably insurgencies and whatnot. But the nukes had been basically taken off the table, and you might have a better sense of this than I. This, engagement, commercial engagement with different countries tends to increase America's, leverage in these instances, right? I mean, there's only so much that we can do with China, which has been horrible in terms of human rights abuses. But when you're talking about a dynamic between Iran and America, the idea that they would buy 100 U.S. planes from Boeing not only is obviously a huge boon for Boeing and American interests, but also it begins to bring Iran back into the sort of the fold, as it were, and could have only led to probably more leverage. Yes.
Oh, I think absolutely. Once Iran has a lot of investment from Europe and the United States, a lot of trade with those places. When it does something that its hardliners really want to do, that the rest of the world is just horrified at, then there's going to be, an avenue of pressure on Iran because it's no longer isolated, and that's why, the hardliners in Iran like Iran's isolation. They were against the Obama deal. And they were very much afraid that it would open Iran to these outside influences.
And so then that just basically gives us a vision of what could have been. Of course, that was not to be, at least for the time being, because you were about to tell us what the Trump administration did to sort of end that progress.
Well, the Trump administration breached the treaty. It was a treaty, and it was signed by President Obama, and it was signed by the other members of the permanent members of the UN Security Council, along with Germany as a kind of representative of the European Union. And what it said was that if Iran closed off all of its plausible avenues towards weaponizing its civilian nuclear enrichment program, because the Iranians had only ever had a civilian program which was intended to provide fuel to reactors and make electricity. But there was always this fear that maybe they might wake up one morning and decide to weaponize it. The agreement made that impossible. There's frequent inspections. Only certain kinds of equipment could be used. They were limited in the number of centrifuges. They couldn't have a heavy water nuclear reactor, which theoretically, you could build up some fissile material on the rods inside. And so Iran was just not in a position really to, at least secretly, make a nuclear weapon if it ever wanted to. It would have to throw out the inspectors and build installations that were obvious to the world. So the Iran nuclear issue went on a back burner. It was really over with for the foreseeable future. And then Trump just pulled out of that treaty. He expected Iran to abide by the terms of the treaty, but then he went around the world strong-arming Japan and South Korea and India and other countries, Italy and so forth, not to buy Iranian petroleum, and using the might of the U.S. Treasury Department, which oversees a $22 trillion a year economy in the United States, a fourth of the world's economy, threatened everybody and his uncle that if they so much as traded with Iran or invested in Iran, that they would be fined billions of dollars. So, for instance, the oil company Shell, a Royal Dutch Shell, was planning to develop Iranian natural gas fields, which are very extensive. And it abruptly pulled out when Trump did this. And so Iran has been reduced to a shadow of its former self economically. Last May, it got down to selling only 250,000 barrels a day of petroleum. It had been selling twice that much, 2.5 million barrels a day. And that's Iran's major source of income. It has carpets and pistachios and so forth, but they don't amount to that much. So the Iranian middle class has suffered this massive downward mobility. People are buying rotten cabbage at the store, and they can't afford, antibiotics and medicines for their family and their children and their grandmothers. They're really suffering very badly. And mind you, there is no legal framework for doing this to Iran. That is to say, the international community, the UN Security Council, says Iranian trade is perfectly illicit. And the European Union thinks it's licit and is trying to, find ways to get around Trump. And the U.S. Congress has not voted to do this. So it's just this Trump and his cronies have decided to get Iran and to starve it out, and have dragooned the world into it with basically organized crime kinds of threats. It's a nice company you have here. Too bad something happened to it.
Right. All right. Well, let's take a break. When we come back, let's start with the overtures from Iran via France to sort of, I guess, restart the deal in some way, and then let's talk about this latest incident in which the administration, anyways, claims that Iran has struck a Saudi oil facility. We will talk about what our relationship with Saudi Arabia is that would compel us to go to war for it. I'm Sam Seder. We're talking to Professor Juan Cole. Be right back. Ring of Fire Radio.